Thank you. Last two members of the junior choir. The rest who are already gone. Our choirs increased in size significantly from first service to second service. And in spite of how it looks, our congregation has increased significantly from first service to second service. We finally have a little bit of respectable winter around here. Isn't that nice? Beautiful. Yeah, it's beautiful outside. I wish I had a little more time to go play in all that wonderful snow. And I don't have to shovel any because my son likes to do that. So I've got it good. The power of wind is nothing new. It has been utilized by humans for thousands of years. But wind power is becoming increasingly important in current times. With growing concerns about pollution and global warming and the depletion of world supplies of fossil fuels, sources of renewable energy take on greater importance. Canway, do you know about Canway? That's the Canadian Wind Energy Association. They claim that wind is the world's fastest growing energy source. Back in 2006, Canway's long-standing and still current president, Robert Horning, noted that he said wind generation has moved out of the margins and into the mainstream in Canada. But Canway's website also points out that Canada has still only scratched the surface of its massive wind energy potential. Nevertheless, over the last few years, particularly, some of that potential has been tapped. As the 9th largest producer of wind energy in the world, Canada currently has 159 wind farms located in every province and territory of our country, except for Nunavut. So I'm going to show you a wind farm that I visited in British Columbia, some pictures. Nobody in First Service got to see them, so enjoy them double. Those wind farms that we have here in Canada have an installed capacity of 6,500 megawatts of electricity. Is that of any use to you? What that means is it's enough to power over 1 million homes. And that's the equivalent of about 3% of Canada's total electricity demand. Ontario, our province, has the most wind farms in the country. We have 46 wind farms with a capacity which is higher than any other province, 2,043.2 megawatts. What that means is we have over 700 wind turbines already installed here in Ontario, and our provincial government has plans to increase wind as an energy source in our province so that by 2030 it will be providing 10% of the total energy generated here in our province. And of course, if you follow things, you might know that these plans have also met with some determined opposition here in our province. Canway believes that wind energy could satisfy 20% of Canada's electricity demand by the year 2025. What that would mean is the ability to power 17 million homes. How about globally? Globally, according to the website of the Global Wind Energy Council, the total installed wind power capacity has risen dramatically in the last 5 years. It now sits at 238 gigawatts, or over 238,000 megawatts, which means that there are now over 199,000 wind turbines that are installed and spinning, or at least potentially spinning, on our planet. And that supplies 2.5% of our global electricity. An article in the winter 2013 edition of the Corporate Knights magazine, which just came out this week, diagrams what is something known as 2030, the Jacobson Plan. Do you know about that? Good, let me tell you about it. This is a scheme of Mark Jacobson, a professor of environmental engineering at Stanford University. These things are big, aren't they? Stanford University, his plan for supplying the 11.5 terawatts of electricity that he believes the world could learn to get by on by 2013. His plan, his whole scheme involves a remarkable 50% of that power coming from wind. In his scheme, it would come from 3.8 million 5-megawatt wind turbines that would be installed around our globe, both onshore and offshore. But in her book called Wind Power, Julie Richards states the obvious. She said this: although the wind is a very useful source of energy, it cannot be switched on or off as needed. At least not by us. But today I would like to review a story about someone who is able to start and stop and direct the wind. It's about a God who is bigger and more powerful than the wind. And so breeze your way to a Bible if you've got one available. Let's blow it open. The target text is Psalm 78, verse 26. Psalm 78, verse 26. We're going to be in Psalm 78 and then go somewhere else for a short while and come back there, so you can stick a marker in there if you have a physical paper version. Psalm 78, verse 26, speaking of God. It says, "He caused an east wind to blow in the heavens, and by his power he brought in the south wind." Here is a God who can actually control and guide the wind. Now, Psalm 78, the psalm reviews in summary form some of the history of the people of Israel. Specifically, as noted in verse 4, if you look in verse 4 of that psalm, it says, "The praises of the Lord and his strength and his wonderful works that he has done." And so what we just read in verse 26, that's just one example of the things that he has done. Okay, but why was God moving around the wind here? Well, it was in response to a challenge from his people. Let's go back up to verse 17 and find out what's going on. Verse 17, Psalm 78. It says, "But they sinned even more against him by rebelling against the Most High in the wilderness. And they tested God in their heart by asking for the food of their fancy. Yes, they spoke against God. They said, 'Can God prepare a table in the wilderness? Behold, he struck the rocks so that the waters gushed out and the streams overflowed. Can he give bread also? Can he provide meat for his people?'" So God responded to their challenge with two miraculous acts. First, verses 23 and 25 tell of how God gave his people manna to eat. When the dew lifted up in the morning, this seed-like substance was left on the ground, and before it melted in the sun, the people were able to gather it up and use it for food. But now let's go back to verse 26 and the wind and read on. Verse 26. It goes on to say, "He caused an east wind to blow in the heavens, and by his power he brought in the south wind. He also rained meat on them like dust, feathered fowl like the sand of the seas. And he let them fall in the midst of their camp, all around their habitations. So they ate and were well filled, for he gave them their own desire. They were not deprived of their craving, but while their food was still in their mouths, the wrath of God came against them and slew the stoutest of them and struck down the choice men of Israel." Now, in the Bible record, we find two instances of God providing his people with birds, specifically with quails to eat. That's not a quail, is it? That looks more like it. The first time that we read of that is it's found in Exodus chapter 16. And the Hebrew people at that point were on their way to the Red Sea. And they were on their way to the Mount Sinai. And they became hungry and they began to complain. "You know, it would have been better for us to die in Egypt, where at least we had plenty of meat and bread to eat, better than to perish from hunger out here in the wilderness." That's what they were saying. And so God graciously promised and provided meat that evening, and he provided bread the next morning. That evening, quails came and they covered the camp, and the next morning, lo and behold, they found manna on the ground. And I think it's interesting to note that the quails were only given that one evening, but the manna continued to fall every day, except for on Sabbath, for 40 years. And perhaps that suggests a lot about what God considered to be the best and most healthy diet for his people. But the passage that we read in Psalm 78 is not talking about that experience. It's referring to the second time that God brought quails to the Hebrew people. And that account we found in Numbers chapter 11. You can go there if you'd like. After nearly a year camped at Mount Sinai, God was now leading the people on toward the promised land. But during their stay at Sinai, they had been given the opportunity to learn better about God, to learn about his ways and his nature, to learn about his care and his provisions, to learn about his laws. Things that needed to be relearned after centuries of slavery in Egypt. So let's go to Numbers 11 now. Let's go and see what happened. Go back to Numbers 11, begin reading at verse 4. Find out what happened here. Numbers chapter 11. Verse 4, it tells us the story. It says, "Now the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense craving. So the children of Israel also wept again and said, 'Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our whole being is dried up. There is nothing at all except this manna before our eyes.'" Now this whining and complaining, which unfortunately was not unusual for these people, this was upsetting both to God as well as to Moses. And so God gave Moses a message to give to his people. And if we go to verse 18, we can see what that message is. Numbers 11:18. God said to Moses, "Then you shall say to the people, 'Sanctify yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat. For you have wept in the hearing of the Lord, saying, Who will give us meat to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt. Therefore, the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall eat not 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20 days, but for a whole month until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have despised the Lord who is among you, and have wept before him, saying, Why did we ever come up out of Egypt?'" So it kind of sounds like if meat is what they wanted, meat was what they were going to get. Now even Moses, who was kind of out of sorts here at this point, even he questions how God could do this. But hey, this is God. Look at what happens next. Here comes the wind now. Go down to verse 31 and we come to the wind. Verse 31 says, "Now a wind went out from the Lord, and it brought quail from the sea and left them fluttering near the camp, about a day's journey on this side and about a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp, and about 2 cubits above the surface of the ground. And the people stayed up all that day, all that night, and all the next day, and gathered the quail. He who gathered least gathered 10 homers, and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. But while the meat was still between their teeth, before it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord was aroused against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very great plague. So he called the name of that place Kibroth Hattaavah, because there they buried the people who had yielded to craving." So God does a miracle of bringing the birds in the wind. It was quite the unbelievable quantity of quail. Now, the Bible translators aren't exactly sure what the last part of verse 31 means. It may mean that the quail were so abundant that they just sort of fell in exhausted heaps, stacked up about a meter high. Can you imagine that, just lying there? Or it may mean that the birds were just fluttering around in midair about a meter off of the ground. Now, I have only myself actually gone hunting once. I don't know about you, but I've gone hunting once, you know? Yep. I went hunting for partridge. You know partridge? Cousins of quail. Equally small brain, apparently. I read that they both have very small brains. So yeah, I went hunting. Actually, it was just when I was a little kid, and we were visiting my aunt and uncle and cousins in New Brunswick. And my Uncle Clarence was going out hunting for partridge, and he agreed to take my sister and I and his 3 kids along with him. Foolish man. But it was kind of exciting, it's kind of an adventure. Have you ever gone hunting? You get to dress up in that orange vest like that. That's not me, but that's what you wear, right, when you go hunting, so hopefully someone doesn't shoot you thinking that you're a partridge. And so we headed out into the woods to rustle us up some partridge. We're going to go hunt some partridge. Now, in actuality, I would have been devastated if we had actually shot and killed anything. And I had a secret plan for that, because I was a little bit worried. We were going hunting, but I didn't really want us to hunt anything. So it was exciting to think that we might actually spot a bird, but I had a plan. And my plan was, if we happened to see anything remotely like a bird, I planned to make enough noise to scare that bird off before my uncle could ever get a shot at it. And I guess really looking back in retrospect, I really didn't have to worry. Because even though Uncle Clarence kept reminding us that the point here was to be quiet, so that the birds wouldn't hear us coming, the fact was, with 5 little kids trooping along, a partridge would have had to have either been in a coma or already dead to not hear us coming in time to be able to, make an escape. So I don't know, we succeeded in scaring off, we think it was a partridge. One bird way up ahead heard us coming and flew away, and so we said, oh, that was a partridge. Oh, we almost got him. But I don't know. My Uncle Clarence, he was carrying his gun, but I don't know if we were really hunting. I think it was more like a walk in the woods is what we were doing. And for whatever reason, he never invited us to go hunting with him again for the rest of that visit. And I don't understand why. Actually, I do. So that's it. I'm not a hunter. That's my very limited, full lifetime hunting experience. But even with the limited experience, it's not too hard to figure out that it would not be very difficult to capture quail if they're just sitting there on stacks in the ground. Or if they're just fluttering there right there. Like, how hard is that to hunt them? Oh, gotcha. That's it. That's all they had to do. And the point is that this was a manifestation of God's power. The arrival of these birds in the wind was no coincidence. This event was in the supernatural realm, beyond the regular occurrences of nature or migration. But the serious side of this miraculous event is the punishment or the consequences that came with it. The Bible doesn't give us details about the plagues that struck the people. Who knows? Maybe it was something from the birds themselves. Maybe it was some kind of, SARS or avian bird flu or something. Whatever the case, God is ultimately depicted as bringing both the birds and the judgment. However you want to look at that, if you want to see that as God causing the judgment or allowing it, whatever your perspective is, sadly for many, the point is it proved deadly. So what really was the big issue here? Well, that's when we can return back to Psalm 78 and take note of what it says in verses 21 and 22 to figure out what's really going on. Psalm 78, verses 21 and 22. This is what it was about. Psalm 78:21, therefore the Lord heard this and was furious. So a fire was kindled against Jacob, and anger also came up against Israel. But why? Why? Verse 22. Because they did not believe in God and did not trust in his salvation. You see, what was on the menu wasn't the main matter at stake here. It was really about the deeper issue of trusting God. If you whip back to verses 7 and 8, it outlines the ultimate purpose for the things that are contained in this psalm. Why was the psalmist writing this stuff down, recounting these stories? That's what it's about in Psalm 7 and 8. It says, that they may set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and may not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that did not set its heart aright, and whose spirit was not faithful to God. If these records are given here to help encourage us to choose a path of hope in God, to help choose us to be obedient to God, then it would be wise for us to consider this story of the birds in the wind and what lessons and principles we can take from it. You see, the central issue in this story is one of attitude in relationship to God. It comes down to a discontented, I want attitude versus a grateful thank you attitude toward the Lord. I want or thank you. The question is, do we submit our desires to God's will, or do we try to submit God to our desires? And so what we find here is a strong caution to be careful about what you crave. Let's look into the story a little bit more. Remember, it's not that God had left his people to go hungry. He had provided plenty of manna to fulfill them and to sustain them. And it's not like manna was some kind of horrendous or hideous stuff. The Bible record indicates that it really had a pleasant enough taste. But as Epicurus remarked, nothing is enough for the man to whom enough is too little. And it started with those people that the Bible calls in the mixed multitude. These people who were not really a part of the children of Israel, but who had, for whatever reason, decided to join them in their escape from Egypt. And it seems that their commitment to Israel's God Yahweh was not as full or complete. Their focus wandered back to their former life in sinful Egypt, and they settled their thoughts on their cravings for the things of that past. Perhaps they had grown bored of the daily provisions provided by God. Perhaps they had grown bored of the seemingly routine monotony of life under his care, stuck out there in the wilderness. And so as they grumbled about their unfulfilled desires, the dissatisfaction caught on and it spread until basically everybody was complaining. Seems that all they could think about was the meat that they wanted, but they didn't have. Unfortunately, they didn't seem to be even half as interested in doing things like giving God praise or seeking his will for their lives. So they pressed the issue to the top of the agenda, bringing about God's response, this miracle of the quails. And yet this supernatural display brought with it a harsh outcome. But why? Why would God perform this miracle of bringing them the meat that they desired just to bring punishment along with it? Why would God do that? Well, the actions of the people in regard to this miracle reveal what a sad and serious state of attitude they had become into. The warning in God's message, remember that we read in Numbers 11, that warning where he said to them they had rejected him and that they would have meat for a month until it became disgusting to them. It seemed like that warning just went right over their heads. All they seemed to be able to see and hear was that they were going to get the meat that they wanted. It's like as soon as they heard they were going to get the meat, it's like their brains shut off and they didn't hear anything else. There is no record in there at all of anything like thoughtful reflection. There's no record at all of a sense of maybe some repentance to say, whoa, what did God just say? Nothing. It's just like, meat. That was their response. Meat. And when the birds and the wind arrived, these people just seemed to go quail crazy. Can you imagine over that? What does it say? All day? Can you imagine these people? All day, all night, all the next day, just pursuing their craving for these quails. Quails, get some more, quails. Man, there's no record in there of thankfulness to God. There's no record in there that they had any kind of recognition that this was a miracle. There's no record at all of the slightest bit of repentance for their attitude. Ellen White, in her book Patriarchs and Prophets, discusses why God needed to act here in this situation. She wrote, "Murmuring and tumults had been frequent during the journey from the Red Sea to Sinai. But in pity for their ignorance and blindness, God had not then visited the sin with judgments. But since that time, he had revealed himself to them at Horeb. They had received great light as they had been witnesses to the majesty, the power, and the mercy of God. And their unbelief and discontent incurred the greater guilt. Furthermore, they had covenanted to accept Jehovah as their king and to obey his authority. Their murmuring was now rebellion, and as such it must receive prompt and signal punishment if Israel was to be preserved from anarchy and ruin." I mean, this was about an attitude of denial of God's power. It was an attitude of rejection of God's leadership. It was an attitude of disregard for God's care. And such an attitude in God's people is very dangerous. It was very dangerous for the children of Israel back then. It's very dangerous for Christians today. We have to bring this to the here and now. We have to bring it to us today. Here's the point. God is able to provide for us anything. That's one more amen than this morning. God can provide for us anything. I mean, anything he wants to give us, anything we might want or desire. I mean, he has the power to control the wind. Come on. You remember how Jesus took 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and what did he do? He fed thousands of people with food to spare. Well, I don't know if God can do it. So it's really not a matter of whether or not God can actually provide for us, which means then that if God has not provided us with something that we want or desire, we would perhaps be wise to stop and think before we start whining and complaining and nursing our discontent. We need to remember who it is that really knows what is best for us, who it is that can see clear through eternity. God has the power to whip up a southeast wind, so to speak, and blow whatever he wants into your life and experience. So as a Christian, this story of the children of Israel and the birds in the wind should remind us of the importance of keeping in perspective the bigger, longer-term picture. We are promised, what are we promised? An eternity with God, in a place with everything you could ever want, as well as things that you don't even know exist yet that you'll also want, but you don't know about them, so you don't want them yet, but when you know about them, you'll want them. That's what we're promised. But in this life, on this planet, as with the manna, sometimes God only gives us what he does to test us, to build our faith and our loyalty. See, because like everything in life, it's a balance, right? On the one hand, we need to learn to be satisfied with God's blessings and provisions, and yet on the other hand, we should never be completely satisfied that we have all we want in this sinful world. Because we need a hope that goes beyond this world. We need a hope that looks forward to something better. And yet we need to balance that discontent with a present dependence upon God. The fact is, not everything we might desire or crave is necessarily for our best long-term good. I really like how that prolific Christian poet, Helen Steiner Rice, expressed it in her poem, God Knows Best. Maybe you've heard this poem. Our Father knows what's best for us, so why should we complain? We always want the sunshine, but he knows there must be rain. We love the sound of laughter and the merriment and cheer, but our hearts would lose their tenderness if we never shed a tear. Our Father tests us often with suffering and with sorrow. He tests us not to punish us, but to help us meet tomorrow. For growing trees are strengthened when they withstand the storm, and the sharp cut of the chisel gives the marble grace and form. God never hurts us needlessly, and he never wastes our pain. For every loss he sends us is followed by rich gain. And when we count the blessings that God has so freely sent, we will find no cause for murmuring and no time to lament. For our Father loves his children, and to him all things are plain. So he never sends us pleasure when the soul's deep need is pain. So whenever we are troubled and when everything goes wrong, it's just God working in us to make our spirits strong. Those of us who are Christians, for those of us here who claim to love and trust Jesus Christ, are we willing to choose to be satisfied with what God has provided for us? That doesn't mean that everything in your life is always going to be easy. I mean, come on, think about it. I think it was easy. It wasn't particularly easy for those Hebrew people to go trooping across the wilderness. That wasn't easy. Day after day after day, you know. I'm sure it got tiresome for them sometime eating the same basic. What should we have today? Oh, I think we're going to have manna. Again? You know, it wasn't easy. It's not that we can't have wants and wishes as Christians, but it's a matter of the general approach that I take. What is my primary focus? Is it an I want, Or is it in a thank you attitude? What do I spend more time and energy thinking about and talking about? What is my focus? Is it what I've got or what I want? It's a huge difference which focus I follow. Is my full allegiance to God dependent on the fulfillment of some item on my wish list of desires? Do I submit my desires to God's will, or do I try to submit God to my desires? It's okay to tell God about what you would like or wish to have, but then it's best to leave that desire with Him. Because what happens is if you begin to dwell on your perceived lack, then that will eventually change your focus, which will in due time change your attitude, which will ultimately change your relationship with God. So we need to be cautious. We need to be careful about what it is that we crave. I'm reminded of a song that highlights a spiritual truth, even though it comes from perhaps an unlikely source. Country singer Garth Brooks. Do you remember this guy? Back in the day. Thinking of a song that he co-wrote with Pat Alger and Larry Bastian called Unanswered Prayers. Don't worry, I'm not going to attempt to sing that for you, but I will read the lyrics. Just the other night at a hometown football game, my wife and I ran into my old high school flame. And as I introduced them, the past came back to me, and I couldn't help but think of the way things used to be. She was the one that I'd wanted for all times. And each night I'd spend praying that God would make her mine. And if He'd only grant me this wish I wished back then, I'd never ask for anything again. Chorus says, sometimes I thank God for unanswered prayers. Remember when you're talking to the man upstairs that just because he doesn't answer doesn't mean he don't care. Some of God's greatest gifts are unanswered prayers. Song goes on. She wasn't quite the angel that I remembered in my dreams, and I could tell that time had changed me in her eyes too, it seemed. We tried to talk about the old days. There wasn't much we could recall. I guess the Lord knows what He's doing after all. And as she walked away, I looked at my wife, and then and there I thanked the good Lord for the gifts in my life. Sometimes I thank God for unanswered prayers. Remember when you're talking to the man upstairs that just because he may not answer doesn't mean he don't care. Some of God's greatest gifts are unanswered prayers. You know what? There are so many good things that God wants us to desire and to crave and to ask Him for. But how easy it is to get longing for things that may not really be very important, may not be a part of God's will and desires for us as individuals, maybe for us as a corporate group of people. And in today's society, man, we are bombarded with sophisticated marketing aimed at making us dissatisfied with what we have. The idea is to nurture in us an all-consuming desire to feel that we must have, we need something that we don't have. The latest thing that starts with an I or has a 10 version with it or whatever the case might be. There's always something new. There's always something different. There's always something allegedly better. And of course, Satan is still hard at work, constantly badgering us with that same old temptation that he's been using ever since he started using it with Eve. That following God and His laws and lifestyle is holding us back from experiencing all of the supposedly wonderful things that are out there in the world. Oh, how he loves to help nurse our discontent and our desires. And frankly, we also need to beware of the mixed multitude phenomenon. Because unfortunately, not everyone in the church is wholeheartedly committed to following Christ. Some are there just because they have a connection with someone else, or maybe they've grown up in the church, or it's just a comfortable place to loiter. And so we need to watch out that the complaints or the longings of another Christian or another group of Christians don't suck us away from a thank you into an I want attitude. We each must take personal responsibility to honestly consider our own cravings, lusts, longings, and desires. So what do you feel like you might be missing? Brother and sister, what do you fancy? What is your desire? What do you want? What do you want? You want prosperity or wealth? What do you want? More things? More stuff? What do you desire? Is it the convenience of a lifestyle that isn't too different from general society? Is that what you'd like? How about popularity or even just acceptance? What do you want? The rush, the excitement, or the mystery of some of the entertainment, substances, practices, or pastimes of the world? Is that what you want? What do you want? More influence? Power? Maybe just recognition would be nice? What do you want? More apparent freedom or variety than the discipline of a life of discipleship to Jesus Christ provides? What do you want? What do we want? Better health? Security? Maybe you want just some improved or maybe some completely new relationships. What do you want? Spiritual growth? Or maybe if we just had a bigger and better church, if we could have a mega church with a few satellites or something like that, or I don't know. Or just, even if we had better leaders, better leaders, better pastors, better elders, if we had more talented and willing members, and if we had better appointed facilities and newer equipment and equipment that actually worked at both services, and if the whole music thing could be improved, so it was like the music that I like, which is the most important thing, and some more money would sure be helpful, right? What do you want? What do you want? And yeah, it's nice to dream and even desire improvements to our situation. It's not bad. We've got to be careful. Before we get caught up in our cravings, we need to learn to notice, be thankful for, and express appreciation to God for what He has provided for us. Thank you should always precede I want. Should always take precedence. As a gracious being who loves to give good gifts, God very often blesses us with more, much more than just our minimum needs. However, God doesn't promise us endless selection and variety on the menu of Christian life on this earth because He knows that wouldn't really be in our best interest. Just give them whatever they want. So we need to be careful. You need to be careful. I need to be careful what you crave. Going to give up your life for quail? Careful what you crave. If you set your heart on it and stubbornly persist in asking God for it, He just might eventually let you have it. And you very well might find sooner or later that what you craved isn't nearly as fulfilling, isn't nearly the joyful blessing that you might have imagined it to be. It's kind of like it says in our scripture reading, Psalm 106:15. And He gave them their request, but sent leanness into their souls. In early 1931, a region in North China where a Christian mission station had been established was experiencing severe famine from a very bad drought that they were facing. And so the missionaries who were there, they had fed many of the destitute Chinese people they were trying to serve from their own food supplies. But eventually the time came when they had nothing left even for themselves. And so in the crisis that followed, they tried to assure their Chinese friends that the God of heaven that they were worshiping was not only a prayer hearing, but a prayer answering God. And they did more than just to merely assure them of this, so they invited these Chinese people to come and join them and to pray to this God each afternoon. And so they started doing that. And on the fourth day after these seasons of intercession began, they were praying that afternoon, and someone came in and they interrupted them. And they said, "You've got to come outside and see what's going on. There's something really strange, unusual happening outside." So the prayer session ended. They went outside. And when they went outside, they looked and they saw this very dark, unusual cloud coming from the north. The wind was pushing it along, and they watched as this cloud came, eventually passed overhead. And as it passed overhead, it began to rain heavily. But it wasn't ordinary rain. It wasn't drops of water. What fell were millions upon millions of dark seeds, which were actually a little kind of grain. And it turned out these proved to be edible, and the supply of seeds that fell from that one cloud was sufficient to tide that whole community of people over until the time of the harvest, and they could get some food. It was only later on that the missionaries learned that a violent storm in Mongolia up to the north had wrecked some granaries where these seeds were stored, and those seeds had been carried some 1,500 miles to be dropped in the very district right on top of these people where prayer was being made. Man, he's a God powerful enough to even control and direct the wind. So can we trust him to take care of us, to provide for what we need, to provide for what is for our best? Do you trust him? Do you trust him? What attitude will you choose to have toward God? A dissatisfied, discontented, and disgruntled I want attitude? Or a appreciative, grateful, and trusting thank you attitude toward God? You know what? As Christians, every day we have to choose. In fact, in reality, every day we do choose between I want and thank you. So what's it going to be for you? I encourage you to think about that as we sing our closing hymn, All the Way. My Savior leads me.